up, I am happy to introduce a great friend and partner from Peace Tech Lab, Tim Receiver. Namely has been partnering with Peace Tech Lab for a few years, and I'm consistently impressed with the work that they do around the globe, reducing violent conflict using technology, media, and data. Tim is here to talk a little bit about the Peace Tech Lab's latest project called Road to Justice, and then he will introduce our keynote speaker, DeRay Mckesson. I want to note that after DeRay Mckesson makes his remarks, our incredible, namely board vice president, Kimberly Moffitt, will be joining him for a Q&A. So I'll pass it off to you, Tim. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. It's great to be with you today. Congratulations on pulling off this really wonderful event. And good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today. As Michelle said, we partnered with Namely for the last couple years. We worked with Michelle very heavily back in March on a 2-week media literacy workshop series for the Western Hemisphere, where we work with organizations from 12 countries. So it's really an honor to be with you today. My name is Tim Receiver. I'm the Director of Programs at Peace Tech Lab, and we are a nonprofit based in Washington, D.C. on the campus of the U.S. Institute of Peace. So the mission of Peace Tech Lab is to explore ways to use media, data, and technology to prevent violent conflict. And we've done things like radio, reality TV shows in Iraq, radio dramas in South Sudan, Global Peace Tech Accelerator, and so much more. And for almost a year now, we've been applying this mission to a program called the Road to Equal Justice, which provides free technology training to organizations working on racial and social justice issues in the US. To date, we've worked with about 283 activists from 150 organizations across Baltimore, Denver, Boston, Miami, and New Orleans. And the organizations have been focused on the issues you would think, like economic justice, criminal justice reform, fair housing, health equity, voting rights, education. And we've had people like Opal Tometi from Black Lives Matter, the ACLU, Vera Institute of Justice, companies like Amazon, universities like the University of Miami and Denver, Hootsuite, and then public defenders and city officials across the country. So what does this training look like? What does it provide? And just really quick, it's all been virtual so far because of COVID, and it includes about 9 hours of training per city. The topics depend on the needs of the community, but so far we've seen things, the needs be on topics like data collection, data analysis, social media strategies, digital securities, just to name a few. And one thing too is where to find the data on the issues that they care about. You would think there would be a lot of data around criminal justice reform or health equity, and that's just not as easy as you would imagine it would be. We also have follow-on training for organizations that have been through our workshops. So back in May, on the anniversary of George Floyd's death, we had a presentation by Witness to discuss the power of eyewitness video. Just this past Friday, we had Salesforce providing training on building out data dashboards to show impact. And we have plans to start in-person workshops in October, and perhaps maybe even a road trip of the country in 2022. All of that is obviously dependent on COVID-19, of course. In our programs over the years, many people have told us that technology is the problem, or at least a major problem in their work. And there's definitely some truth to that statement. We've seen the downside of technology over the past few years. Platforms like Facebook, Twitter, spreading outright racism and lies for years. We've seen the deadly consequences with the needless deaths from COVID-19 misinformation for more than a year. Technology, it was used to organize the terrorist attack on the Capitol on January 6th. And these platforms are just magnifying problems that have been with us for centuries. What has changed is the speed at which these messages now spread. We definitely can't fix all the bad things that technology does, but there are ways to use it in a positive way to help scale and accelerate organizations doing great work. And we've seen this intersection of technology plus social justice. We've seen that move mountains just last summer, and the world took notice. And no one personifies this intersection better than DeRay Mckesson. DeRay is a civil rights activist focused primarily on issues of innovation, equity, and justice. We invited him to give our very first keynote at our very first event for the Road to Equal Justice in his hometown of Baltimore back in October. DeRay has been a leading voice in the Black Lives Matter movement and a co-founder of Campaign Zero. Spurred by the death of Mike Brown and the subsequent protest of Ferguson and beyond, DeRay has been a key player in the work to confront systems and structures that have led to mass incarceration and police killings of Black and other minority populations. He's also the host of the award-winning weekly podcast, Pod Save the People, which creates space for conversation around the most important issues of the week related to justice, equity, and identity. DeRay frequently appears on national media outlets, including The Daily Show, The Colbert Report, NPR, MSNBC, CNN, and many others. He's also been covered in a range of publications, including Vogue, Vanity Fair, Vice, The New York Times, Washington Post, and the Baltimore Sun. He's a board member of Rock the Vote, was named one of the world's great leaders by Fortune magazine, and one of the 30 most influential people on the internet by Time magazine. It's my honor to welcome DeRay to Namely's 2021 conference. DeRay, thanks for being here today.
It's my honor to be here. I literally, as you were talking, the DC Police Union released a ridiculous statement that I had to screenshot really quickly to put at the end of the presentation so I could talk about it. But it is an honor to be here. I'm gonna go quickly through some things because I know I don't have a ton of time, but I spend most of my time on issues of policing and criminal justice. And while Campaign Zero, we focus on the policy, practices, and laws, I also know that how we tell this story shapes the way we think about what we do. I'll jump right in so that we don't waste any time. But one of the reasons, the core reason why we called it Campaign Zero was this idea that we can actually live in a world where the police don't kill anybody, that we can get to zero. So we think about zero as both a goal and a reset, that we want to help people realize that the starting point is a place where you get to make up what community looks like, that all of this is man-made, and because it's man-made, we can actually make it better. Now, the first thing I'll say is that we actually challenge both the institution of policing and the logic of policing. A lot of times, especially in 2014, when the protest began, people would say, why are you talking about issues of identity when we are talking about the police? Why does it matter that people are queer? Why are we talking about gender violence? We should actually just be talking about the police and not get distracted. And what we remind people is that the logic of policing actually manifests in a host of ways. The logic says there are people with more power who make the rules, policies, and practices, and the actual policing mechanism is the violent enforcement of those laws, policies, and practices. And that's often on people who have less power, people of color, people who structurally are poor. That's how the logic works. So what is homophobia if not heteronormative values and beliefs, policies and practices that are violently enforced on other people? What is transphobia if not heteronormative values and beliefs that are violently enforced on other people? So we remind people that the actual police officers are the most visceral manifestation for most people of this logic. But the logic of policing actually shows up in a host of ways. It's why in our language we say you're policing his behavior. That language is a reminder that the logic is about the violent enforcement of ideas. And that is not only the institution of policing. It is both a logic that permeates society that we want to undo, which is why we talk about issues of identity in moments of protest in this way. Now, go back to 2020. People talk about 2020, and 2020 is probably the best year from a media standpoint about the protests, because there's probably no year where more people just understood the issue. And yet, look at the data. The police killed more people in 2020 than every single year of data we have except for 2018. It was not a win. 2020 was a bad year. We actually thought the opposite would happen. We thought that so few people would get killed in 2020 because everybody was inside, that it might actually change the trajectory of the numbers, given that it would pull the average down. It didn't. The police killed so many people that it's just sort of the same. Remember, we have no data before 2013. So if you got killed by a police officer before 2013, we don't know. But 2020 was not a good year. For all the magazine covers, all the TV specials, all the interviews, it actually changed nothing about police behavior in the moment. Now, this is actually this year, and it does look like this year is slightly below last year. So this year is dark red. Last year was pink, but it's still sort of in the same trend line. So every year the deaths are around 10, 15 off, but it's still around 1,100 people get killed by the police every single year. In 2021 looks to be similar to the rest of the years. I say that because the media narrative, sometimes I read these articles and I'm like, whew, the police just packed up and went home. That's what the media will have you believe, is that the police are afraid and they're scared and da-da. And you're every piece of data says the police are doing exactly what the police have been doing. Now, remember that there are 3 databases of police violence. And I say this because it's interesting when we think about media literacy, so much of it is knowing knowing where what you're talking about came from. There are three big databases of police violence. So when people tell me a number that the police killed, I'm always interested in where it came from. So the Washington Post, we like the Post. The Post is a source that most people know. Now, here's the thing. The Washington Post only includes on-duty killings that include a gun. So this means that George Floyd's not in that database. He was not killed with the gun. This means that Botham Jean, if you remember Botham Jean, Botham was killed by Amber Geiger. She walked into his apartment in the middle of the night and killed him. She was off duty when she killed him. And remember, the Washington Post only includes on-duty killings with a gun. So Botham Jean's death is not in here. And the Washington Post also codes you as armed if you had anything in your hand at the time of death. So this means that Tamir Rice is armed, according to them. If you had a bucket, if you had a Nintendo controller, whatever it is, you are armed in their database. Fatal encounters, we like fatal encounters a lot. Fatal encounters includes two big categories that the other two databases don't include. So that is suicide by cops. So if you kill yourself in the presence of the police, or medical emergencies. If you have a heart attack in the presence of police, they count those and we don't. But there are a lot of those around the country, and that's a whole different conversation. And Mapping Police Violence is a database that we created. It is all on duty, off duty, all weapons where an officer was actively involved in the death of another person. And this is interesting, is that when we look at police violence, most people think it's in cities. And when we look at the data, we're like, it's not. You know, the police kill more people in the suburbs, almost all not cities. Cities is one of the only places that it's getting better. There are a lot of reasons why we think this is true, but it's so interesting because when I hear people on the radio and TV talking about it, you would really think that it is just the major cities. And actually, the problem is in places that are not media hotbeds, places where there's not a potentially like a organizing collective that is just focused on this day in and day out, which doesn't mean the problem is not present. Now, we are always trying to figure out how do we make sure that we never let the system off the hook. And the reason why we fight at the system level is that the system is the only thing that scales. So programs are cool. I believe in programs. I used to run an after-school program in Baltimore. I was a chief of human capital in the school system in Baltimore when I was 30. So I've done all of the things I taught, like I get it. But the system is the only thing that scales. So while we think programs are cool, the Panthers free breakfast program was a good program. The beauty of it, though, is that it became a scale systemic program. Scale solutions are the things that will actually save everyone. Now, I'll show you this too. One of the things that we have to show people all the time is just how consistent the problem is. So people look and they're like, you know, we know the police kill people, but it's like, did you know that there are only 9 days where the police didn't kill anybody? You look at the month of February. The police killed somebody every single day in February. You look at June, there's only 1 day where they didn't kill someone. Is that like, you know, not every story becomes a news story, but that doesn't mean that real people's lives aren't impacted. I'll show you this just because this is something you probably already sort of heard before you would hear it from me, is that most of the encounters that lead to police violence actually are not things that were precipitated by violent crime. So you see mental health, traffic stops, domestic abuse, other nonviolent disturbances. And we believe that there has to be a way, especially for these, where you can have an intervention in crisis and conflict that don't result in the death of anybody. You probably already know this too, that Black people are only 13% of the US population, but about 27% of all killings by police. Black people are more likely to be unarmed and not reportedly threatening someone. All this is publicly available data that I can show you. This is at policeviolencereport.org, which is something that we put out, but you know this. Now, what I wanted to spend more time on today was talking about crime. So I'll show you this too, because I'm fascinated by this. So you probably remember when Adam Toledo got killed by the Chicago PD. We were interested in how many young people get killed by police departments. And we saw that Chicago is the far outlier. We also saw, and we didn't anticipate, that Columbus PD and the NYPD would kill the same number of kids roughly in the data set. Harris County sheriffs, they are the sheriff department over Houston. So who knew that Houston had a particular problem in this? But we always use the data to help us see what is true and what's not true. And the reason we do it is that the stories we tell shape the lessons we learn. And we're in this really interesting media moment for teachers, for people around kids, for anybody actually, because adults are the main purveyors of this crime narrative. And I'm going to use the NYPD and DC. DC literally just tweeted something. I just got this tweet during the intro that I'm going to show you at the end. But I'm really interested in crime. So people, you have seen people be like, crime's increasing, da 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 da. And I'm always interested in like, what is crime? And I'm going to use the NYPD as an example because NYPD was one of the first big police, they're the biggest police department in the country, but one of the first cities to do what's called comp stat. So they publicly release all crime statistics every week. Now, we always challenge people on what crime is, and I will show you why. So if you look at the comp stat, I highlighted it, is the way they talk about it is crime complaints. Because when you look at crime data is actually complaint data. You're not omniscient. I don't know how many things actually got stolen in New York City. I don't know how many murders there were in New York City. I don't know how many carjackings there were in New York City. Nobody does. We only know how many of those things was reported. So we always remind people that from jump, when you say crime, you really mean reported complaints. Because I don't know how many crimes happen. In the same way that like I know a lot of crazy stuff's happening on Wall Street. I know there's insider trading. That doesn't mean that there's no insider trading just because it didn't get reported. And we always sort of challenge people about this because we know that there's over-reporting of these metrics in low-income communities and Black communities, which doesn't mean that they're the only communities that it's manifesting. You think about things like marijuana. We know that in New York City, Black and brown people and white people use weed at the same rates. We also know that Black people are over-policed for it. 70% of the arrests and tickets for marijuana are Black and brown people in New York City. We know that Black and brown people aren't the only people. So we always push people like, what is crime? Crime data is always complaint data. Now I'm gonna show you, we're gonna stay on this chart for a second because this will be the anchor, but I'm gonna show you how fascinating it is that not enough people know how to read the crime data, but the news just has us believing things that aren't true. So the anchor question for this conversation about like, what does it mean to be media literate in the criminal justice space is this idea of, is violent crime increasing or decreasing? Before we can even engage that question, there's a fundamental question. What is violent crime? Violent crime is actually not one thing. Violent crime is 7 things. Violent crime is a catch-all term for all of these things combined. If you want to talk about one of them separate, then you should talk about it separate. Murder, rape, robbery. But when you use the phrase violent crime, that actually means something across the country and with the FBI. The FBI violent crime stats are a collection of these things. Nobody's violent crime is actually one thing. Most laymen, when they hear violent crime, they think murder or they think assault maybe. But when we look at violent crime, the stats are always compiled as a collection. GLA at the end is larceny, is like stealing cars, a grand larceny auto. So start here with the like, what is violent crime? A lot of people don't know that violent crime is not one thing, it's many things. Now, what's fascinating is that though crime is falling, people don't believe it. And a lot of this is because of the media. That when you probably heard the summer of violence, bloody summer, we got out of COVID and people are killing each other. That like the media narrative around crime is actually not reality of what's happening in community. So if you look on the left, it shows us the number of people who believed crime had increased from the previous year. And then you look at the right and you see that crime is dropping. Crime has been dropping for 20 years and people just don't believe it. And part of it, there are a couple reasons, but a big one is because of the media. That these spikes in this idea that like crime is pervasive, or people see one murder video or they see one sort of thing in their neighborhood and they think that's the whole city, and the media just reinforces that narrative over and over. It is mind-boggling. Even in places like New York, you look at subway crime, it's like, every way that we can track data over time, crime is historically low over time. Now, I'm going to walk you through this, but I'm going to give you a minute without me talking to look at this. This is CompStat. This is the New York City Police Department. This gets released every single week. This is the most recent one. And I want you to just look at this for a second, and then we'll talk about it. Okay, now let's go to some of the news stories. On June 30th, Newsweek reported that the city received a $200 million increase because New York City experienced a 22% increase in crime compared to the same month last year. So this story is just like this is just a snapshot of the way that the NYPD crime increase has been reported for the entire summer. And here, and the NYPD used it as a justification for going from 5.2 billion to 5.4 billion. This is from AM New York. This was a July 6 article. This is something else. This shows shootings and murders in the city decreased in June of this year compared to last year. Now, this story is an outlier in the grand scheme of the stories because most of the stories about a spike in crime, but you do see people sort of tease it out. I'm showing these two just to show you that like the data can tell you whatever story you want. And because most people don't even know the data exists, even people on our side, the media reports dictate so much of what people think. So one version is saying crime increased, another version is saying crime decreased or shootings and murders decreased. Let's look at what it says just straight up. So if you look, I want to show you a couple of things. One is people keep talking about murders. Now, when you look at the week to date, murders are down 46%. You look at the 28-day, murders are down like year to year, 28-day, murders down, that's the green. And then you look at that first line, you look at year to date, it does look like murders are up. You look at the 2-year change, murders are up. But you look at 11-year and more than that, murders are down. So we could tell a host of stories. When I tell this story about over time, murders are not up. When I tell the story about the most recent period of time, murders are not up. You also look at, I color coded the red things as like the things that were increases and not helpful, and then the yellow as a decrease. You look at the far right. When we look at the longest period of time, every single thing is a decrease. Crime is not increasing overall. And when we think about this last year, we think this last year is such an anomaly. It's one of the only years ever with crime data that homicides increased in almost every single major city except for 3, I think. We've never seen that happen ever. Normally homicide increases in sort of weird spikes or like we can explain it because of something. This is sort of a universal increase. And what's the only other universal thing that happened to everybody? The pandemic and people being unemployed and laid off and all that. But you look at this and it's like crime is actually not, the data does not say crime is like on the whole increasing. When you even look at the total year to date, crime is actually decreasing. You look at rape, you look at robbery, you look at grand larceny. Those are decreasing over the 2-year. You look at robbery and burglary; those are decreasing year to date. Is that like the data actually just doesn't say what the NYPD is publicly saying? This idea that like there's a wild spike in crimes. It's like, there's a coherent argument at least to challenge that, but an even stronger argument over time to say that that actually just isn't true. There are other stories saying that like crimes in the transit system in the subway in New York are increasing. And it's like purple, look at the purple. That's just not true either, right? Transit week to date down. The 28-day is one more than not. Year to date down, 2-year down, 11-year down. That like, there are a host of ways that you can cut this that show you that like this is not some wild summer of violence. And I'll show you this because this was fascinating. Literally, this just got tweeted. So DC, there was a shooting yesterday at the National Park, which most of you probably saw. The DC Police Union tweeted, "Welcome to DC, where violent crime permeates everything." So very quickly during my intro, I went and pulled the DC crime stats. And here are the stats as of July 16th. Now, again, you see that violent crime is, they separate it out. Violent crime is not increasing. Their own data says violent crime is not increasing. Homicide's not even increasing in DC at this moment. But you look at the propaganda is like violent crime permit. You're like, your data doesn't even say that. There's a decrease in violent crime. There's actually a decrease in total crime from your data. This is a screenshot from the DC CompStat data. I say all this to say that like so much of our work is helping people like understand like what is true and what's not true, helping people look at the data themselves so that they can actually make decisions. We remind people that none of this is too complicated, that one of the ways that the status quo continues itself is that it forces people to believe that like you're just not smart enough. And we always tell people that there's no problem bigger than community. That community is always bigger than our biggest problem, that we can actually understand this. You can fight it, you can challenge it, that you can like make something new. And so much of it is around how we tell the story. The last thing I'll say is this idea that when most people say the police, really what they mean is a person with a gun. And I've started rhetorically to just do that to people. So people are like, well, we need the police to do that. I'm like, do you really need a person with a gun to tell you that your tail lights out? I don't know, right? Do you really need a person with a gun to deal with the missing kids or the kid that ran away? I think there are a lot of people that could probably do that. Do you really need a person with a gun to address homelessness in the corner? No, I think there are a lot of things. So some of it is like, how do we tell the story in ways that help people understand? And remember that like the truth is so crazy that we actually don't need to embellish it. Like the truth is so nuts that I don't need to like try to convince you. I can actually just show you. And the last thing I'll say is this is a court transcript from a case in Baltimore that we're working on. This is the conversation between the firearms examiner and the lawyer. So the lawyer is asking them, the firearms examiner, how did he compare the shell casings to the test fires from the gun to say that the shell casings came from the gun? I'll give you a second to read this very pixelated screenshot. I did not, this is literally a screenshot. When asked, did you measure something? No. So you eyeballed it? Yes. That is unbelievable. This man is facing 50 years in jail because of his testimony. The firearms examiners testified that the shell casings came from this gun. And when asked, did you have notes? He said, I don't take notes. When asked, did you take pictures? I didn't take pictures. Did you measure it? No. Is it you? Did you eyeball it? Yes. We can't be putting people, I mean, that is wild. That's wild. So, you know, when we think about the media part of it, it's like most of the stories I read are just not true. I'll read stories that say, you know, crime increase. I go look at the crime data, didn't increase. I'll read stories that say Chicago banned chokeholds. I'll go read the bill and see if it actually is a ban on chokeholds. It's not. I'm always surprised at how little the media gets right in the criminal justice space. I'll stop there. Honored to be here and honored to be in community with people who are committed to this work.
DeRay, thank you so much for your remarks and your ending. I wrote it down, the direct quote. You said, the truth is so nuts, we don't need to make it up. And I think that's quite powerful and speaks mounds about where we are right now and the role that media literacy plays in so much of this. So thank you so much for all of your remarks. I'll start with a few questions that we've already received from the audience. The first of which asks the question that you started out as a grassroots activist, and arguably many may suggest that you have become mainstream. Do you ever feel your message or practices have ever been compromised or diluted or even taken a more reformist approach as a result?
Yeah, so I appreciate the question. Now, here's the thing. I'm always fascinated by this framing because I think the framing plays into a politics of dominant culture that people don't intend to play into, but it does. So here's what I'd say is that I believe in the end of solitary confinement. And you probably do too, Kimberly, right? Like we probably shouldn't lock people in rooms for 23 hours. Now, you and I both know that the end of solitary confinement is not the end of incarceration. It's not. Does it make it a bad thing to want to fight it? No, right? Because we know that our responsibility is not theoretical. I'm not like an abolitionist because I read about it. I'm a practitioner. So my responsibility is to make sure the system harms you as least as possible. And that actually is not in conflict with my overall goal of undoing the entire system. So no, the end of solitary confinement is actually not in conflict with the end of incarceration. And if you believe it is, then my push to you would be like, then you have actually let go of a responsibility to real people in the moment. So when I think about things like chokehold bans or not shooting and moving vehicles, I know that that's not the end of policing. I get it. I'm not I didn't lose my mind. I also know that if your sister doesn't get choked to death, that's actually a good thing. And that these things are actually not in conflict. It is actually a system of white supremacy that makes us fight each other at the strategy level about things that save people's lives. That I think that everybody who's incarcerated should have a healthy meal. That's not the end of incarceration. I get that. But these strategies are actually not in conflict. So if it is mainstream to believe that you shouldn't be choked to death, then like, I'll take that. If it's mainstream to think that you shouldn't be locked in a cage for 23 hours a day, then like, I'll take that. What I actually think happens is that people sort of feel like they have to fight it, that like there's a finite space for us to be in. And if we don't like, I don't know, perform the most radical thing in the moment, then like we're not authentic. When in reality, like I know that this is always a both and. I'm trying to strip the carceral state from existing in its totality. I also know that I'm not the first person to do that, and that seems to be a longer battle. And in the moment, there are a lot of things that I can do right now to save people's lives, and I'll never not do them because of some theoretical commitment.
And I think you're so right that it is a both and. All of this work that you are committed to doing and other grassroots activists are doing is much more nuanced. And it does require us to think a more nuanced approach instead of believing it has to be either or, which is what I think the media has certainly helped to play a part in. Our next question is, what do media outlets have to gain by manipulating the crime statistics or making the audience think that there is more crime in a particular area than there is?
Yeah, so you know the answer to this, that the most basic thing about the media is that they need customers, right? And A Summer of Crime is not only a good story in the moment, but it's a story that lives. You can pump out A Summer of Crime. What happened? Okay, you can pump out A Summer of Crime story every week. It's just a story that it lives. It just like keeps going and keeps going and keeps going. And that matters. So part of our work is to like give reporters different stories, right? Like I can fight you on the facts, but I also just need to give you different stories to tell. It's like Trump. It's like, why did they cover Trump so much? It's just a story that lives. It lives and lives and lives. And I think it's no more, I think it's that simple, actually.
Yep. We know that violence sells, right? It grabs our attention and it keeps us focused in. There's a reason why Law and Order has the longevity that it does in many of its series. So clearly, this is something that works to the media industry's favor.
I would push and say it's not even that violence sells as much as fear sells.
Absolutely.
And the more and more you make people afraid, the more and more they'll just consume a whole lot of things, right? That's why when we are in rooms writing bills and stuff, the police, that's their only tactic. Like they don't have like a good reason why they should be able to choke people to death. But what they'll say, literally, we have police chiefs say to us, if you ban these things, what am I supposed to do? If Kimberly's getting killed, is my officer supposed to go back to his car and read the manual before he intervenes? Like that's their argument. And you'd be surprised that it works. It works more than it doesn't work. And like the fear is actually what they have. That is the thing that travels.
Yeah, agreed. What advice do you have for young people about how to use social media to convey more accurate information about Black and Brown communities outside of the mainstream media?
I think that there are a couple things that that our opponents on the right have done well that I think sometimes we get lost in. Is like the best message doesn't always win. It's the message that people remember and can take with them. And I think sometimes we like try and tell like the most nuanced and sometimes it's like everybody just deserves a breakfast, lunch, and dinner. That's it. I'm not fighting with you about communism. I'm not fighting with you about socialism. Because I'm always trying to convince my aunt. My aunt is always the audience. So when I call Aunt Mink and I'm like, hey, Aunt Mink, do you believe in socialism? She is like, DeRay, I got 3 kids. Like, she's like, I don't got time for this. Like, but when I'm like, Aunt Mink, do you think that everybody deserves breakfast, lunch, and dinner? She's like, of course, easy. Like, not even a battle, right? And I think that so much of our work, like for young people, it's like, how do we tell the simplest truth all the time? That's it. So people are like, DeRay, do you believe in defund? Obviously, but like, I'm not going to fight you about a word. I don't care. I'm going to fight you about the idea. Do I think that we spend too much money on this thing that hasn't produced results? Absolutely. I can take that to my aunt. My aunt is like, she lives in Baltimore. Baltimore is in some way, we have had 6 years of 200 murders. So she's not on the like take the money away train when I sell it like that. But I'm like, girl, we wasting money. She's like, oh, we can't waste money. Like, so how do we actually get people to focus on the ideas? And sometimes, I have to remind myself to not be so arrogant to believe that the only way to enter is the way we enter. And there are a lot of people, defund's a good example. There are a lot of people who are like, well, if you don't believe in that, then you don't believe in Black people. It's like, how dare you tell my aunt or my grandmother or so-and-so who lost their son, like, how dare you become the arbiter of what people believe in Black people? That like, sometimes we actually have to change the way that we invite people into the space so that they actually can bring what they bring, and then we can use that and move them further. And like, that is what I think the work has to be. The last thing I'll say on that issue is that part of our work too is to give people space to do the thinking so that we're not the only people preaching. So, when people fight me about George Floyd, I'm like, well, should he be alive or not? Like, should, like a simple question to make them do the thinking as opposed to me giving a lecture.
Okay. Let's ask another question around support for educators. How would you recommend educators implementing this information into their curriculum? And what about media centers who offer media literacy education to the general public?
Yeah, I think that, the thing that helped me be very media literate was read like the primary sources. So like, even what I showed you, it's like reading the articles that are like spikes in crime, and then like just going to CompStat and being like, was it a spike in crime or not, right? Like those sort of things, like the more and more that teachers help young people, and frankly, anybody, because the adults got it bad too, know how to like take an article, read it, and then go find out whether it's true is actually, you'd be shocked at how few people could do. I had a call with somebody and they were like, we track use of force policies. And they were like, you didn't give Illinois credit for banning chokeholds. And I was like, I don't think they banned chokeholds. He was like, no, they banned chokeholds. So in the call, we're on Zoom, we go pull up the bill. We read the bill. The word chokehold is in the bill, but it's not defined, which means that it actually doesn't mean anything. And just so you know, from like a technical perspective, a chokehold is technically restriction of your airway. A stranglehold or carotid restraint is a restriction of your muscles. In effect, they're the same thing. Where you're being choked to death, it's unclear whether the person's like constricting your neck muscles or your airway. The bill didn't define either. So it actually did not ban chokeholds, but all of the press was like, Illinois banned chokeholds. And you're like, if I didn't know how to read the legislation myself, the media would have convinced me that like our work was done and our work there on this issue was far from done.
So I'll ask another question, and I'm personalizing this because, like Stephanie, I'm also in Baltimore, and I'm really curious to hear your perspective in terms of how the media portrayed the Freddie Gray situation that happened here, and what you thought could have and should have been done differently to really give a true sense of what we were experiencing in Baltimore and what it meant in terms of the loss of life of this particular young man.
Yeah, so I think the coverage of Freddie Gray was fine. I think about all the other people though who were not Freddie Gray, who the police have terrorized. That like, why are we not covering those? I just had a conversation with a reporter in Baltimore last week, and he, we're working on this case, and he was sort of pressing me about one detail in the case that, in some ways, might look like an inconsistency or like an anomaly. So I answer his question. I'm like, no, that's not true. And then I say to him, I'm like, in this case, the police straight up lie. Like, not like, oh, I think it wasn't true. Lie. And I'm like, why is that not front page? Like, I don't even know why. Like, if the defendant had lied on the stand, this would be news. It would be like, I can't believe the police lie. And it's just like another day in Baltimore. And you're like, well, that can't be. Like, that has to be wild too. And they lie, in this case, they lie about the basic, right? They lie about everything basic to not basic. So like, this guy gets shot by the police by 4 officers. He gets handcuffed. He gets shot 3 times. He gets shot at 40 times, shot 3 times. He gets handcuffed. At the trial, they ask all 4 of the officers, one by one, they say, who handcuffed him? Every single officer gives a different answer. How? If 4 defendants got on the stand and gave 4 different answers about a thing, y'all would be like, wrap it up, it's a lie. The police do it, and you're just like, oh, another day of trial. You're like, what? That can't be real. Another thing in this case is that the police say, we called the medics immediately. He gets shot 3 times, 1 in the face, chest, back. You look at the dispatch record, I lie to you not. Literally, they say, do you need like a medic? And the officer says, we have him in custody, no injuries here. This man is shot 3 times on the ground bleeding out. She says, no, you lie. That is a lie. So I'm always shocked that the media just like, and with the local press, one of the hardest parts with the police is that they sort of need the police chief to always answer the phone. They need those people. So they're like slow to attack them because like that's part of their clients, which is a hard thing to battle.
I've got time for one more question if you'll so allow me to do so. And this question speaks specifically about police violence and raises the question of, should there be an effort of covering police violence under a more international framework? American media seems to focus on the problem only in the US, while if one considers numbers of police violence in the continent, the situation is similar.
Yeah, I think that could be helpful. I think that we actually have to move away from problem storytelling to solution storytelling. Like, people get it. People are like, the police kill people, got it. You actually don't need to hear me say it. I can help contextualize it. I can help you think about the suburbs differently than the city. But like, you don't need me to come in to be like, the police are killing people. What people need more stories about is like how to end it, right? Like, what does it look like? So when we think about moving money, no one strategy is enough. So moving money is not going to do it alone. Use of force policy is not going to do it alone. Demilitarization is not going to do it alone. What are alternatives to the police? As much as we talk about them, there is no alternative. There's no city with an alternative to the police that is scaled in a community of color. So people talk about Cahoots in Eugene, Oregon, good program. 3% Black people. That's not I can't take that and put it in Baltimore, right? So how do we start to like help people actually like tell stories about what the solutions look like that actually put everybody sort of on blast and like remind us of that? I actually think the police win when all of our storytelling is problem storytelling. Because I'll tell you, when we get in the room, when we're writing these bills and these policies, the police are amped. They are ready. They don't care about the press conference, because when we get in the room, so like in Maryland, I'll tell you, we tried to get all police disciplinary records public. The police didn't even fight. They didn't fight the issue head on. They went to the Senate and said, if you make all of our disciplinaries public, then you should also make every ethics complaint against the legislator public. They were ready. And that worked. So we got a lot public, but not everything. And it's the police are amped up. So part of our work has to be like, how do we make the case for public records? How do we make the case for use of force changes? How do we make we actually need to make those cases, because all you need is 2 murders in a weekend and public sentiment moves against, like people feel really strongly about crime. So when you do things that are cosmetic or one-time things that aren't structural, we're at the whims of public sentiment, which are not great.
DeRay, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us about such an important issue. And I'm loving following your journey and seeing the work that you're still committed to doing well after any of the notoriety that's associated with one particular death. And certainly as a Baltimore native son, we appreciate the work that you continue to do here and across the nation. So thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today.
So good to be here. Talk to you later.
Yeah, thank you, DeRay. I'll echo that as well. Really appreciate his comments. Geez, he really amplified the need for us to be analytical thinkers, to use media literacy to amplify that process. And a special message too, I think, for the young people, TikTok media makers out there. Keep your messages today simple, reinforcing, solution-oriented, and tell them to convince DeRay's auntie. So just a couple more things. Be sure to attend today's town halls. Again, remember, they are not recorded. One is going to be by our friends at RAND on media literacy and research in an era of truth decay. Or you could attend maybe the simultaneous town hall called Righteous Discomfort, Social Justice in the Classroom, where a panel of seasoned educators will discuss what to say and how to say it when teaching media literacy in these tumultuous times. Although I think we got a nice sense of advice from Dr. Jeff Scher a little bit earlier on the fact that we really just have to have the courage, overcome fears, and do what's right. Do what young people, like we heard last night from our friends from Sesame. This is what young people want. This is what we have to do. So if that latter town hall interests you, you'll especially want to attend the roundtable session that follows, that we're going to have, a smaller sort of conversations going on exploring challenges and sharing strategies for effective critical media literacy. So enjoy your day. We look forward to seeing you all throughout the day, and especially at the keynote this evening, so that we can see the young people's presentations and their long day of work. So thanks. Have a great day.
That was awesome, guys. Stephanie, that was perfect wrap up. I'm going to go to the youth media room and get them going. Bye, guys.
Bye. Thanks.